Well, hello there. Brent here with Bring Your Own Tools, and if you want to see how we built this geodesic dome treehouse with a skylight, keep on watching. Let's get started.
In order to make a one-of-a-kind treehouse for my kids, I had to be creative, and in order to do so, I decided to make a geodesic dome style with these Maggie dome connections, which made it very easy to install as far as the framing goes. The sheathing and custom skylight definitely made it more time-consuming, but I felt well worth it, and once we're in a position for siding, I picked up this siding nailer along with stainless steel nails that were extremely useful and important when installing Cedar shake. Now I sided all the walls of our geodesic dome, but by the time I got to the roof, it started downpouring. As you can see, fortunately for us, I did waterproof the structure correctly so I didn't have any leaks, but I had to wait a week in order to get to some drier days. In order to have a proper transition between the shake siding on our walls, in contrast with the cedar shake on our roof, we had to bring in some roofing flashing. Now this is steel drip edge roof starter flashing, and after it's installed on one side with our stainless steel nails, I strike a line at the dead point of our cedar shake below and then cut that off as cleanly as possible. Once it's cut on the long vertical section on the top, I then am able to twist it to the angle that I want it. It's nailed off, but I do apply some type of silicone just to make sure that that seam isn't a weak point later on after the entire surface is fully installed. I proceed to nail off the remaining section, but as I make it to my next side, I am short because these pieces are only 10 feet long, so I have to continuously cut and mold each section together. Luckily for us, it's basically the same exact process because all we're doing is striking a line, cutting that section straight, applying some silicone, and then nailing it off accordingly. Once I inevitably make it around the entire structure, I do apply some flashing tape over all of my nails, along with making sure that there's a nice quality seam that's placed in between our flashing along with our roofing membrane above. This is important and good practice because we want to make sure that if there's any moisture that gets underneath our cedar shake, that it can still drain downwards off of our flashing and onto the face of our siding below. We are now finally ready for our cedar shake, and this is our undercourse cedar shake. Yes, the roof does have to have 2 layers at this very first row because of the seams, and I mark exactly where I want this first piece to be cut. Then I bring it over to my small battery operated miter station, cut exactly where I marked those 2 lines, and as you can see, this is a small station, so I do have to flip over the board in some circumstances just to cut off all the excess, but it's a lot easier to manage a small miter station like this than my large 12-inch miter saw, which would take up a lot of space, especially in a small area like this. Once I have my corner nailed off, I can then proceed to installing the remainder of this row, but keep in mind we do want approximately a 1/4 inch of space in between each one of our cedar boards. As I make my way to the opposite side, I do find it easier to actually have this final piece cut and installed first, and then find a shingle that fits in between these 2 cedar shakes. From my perspective, this is a lot easier, and if I can't find a specific size for these 2 cedar shakes, I can always cut one down to size. Plus, if there's any overhang, I can remove it very quickly and easily with a utility knife. Just make sure you're not going too deep into your roofing membrane. With our first under row course installed, I can now start installing our second layer, and this second layer is just applied to this first row of shingles on all sides. We are overlapping our seams on every single first row on this entire roof structure, but this is the only one that we do this for. As we make our way up to the second row, I strike a line at 6 inches because I want that spacing in between each row, and then I bring in my level and make sure we're at an appropriate levelness before I strike a line. If we're good, then I strike a line and start immediately installing our next row. Keep in mind that you do want to strike all these nails approximately at the 7-inch mark, so each nail is completely concealed once you start installing the next row, but it is a bit difficult to gauge that 7-inch mark every single time, so if you're a little off, no big deal. Just don't go below 6.5 inches from personal experience. As I make my way up to the final row of shingles on this first side, I do have to cut every single one down to size because I don't want them to protrude past our acrylic skylight. And as a general side note, because this is such a unique build, I did have to get creative with the layering process once we get to the final steps of trimming out our skylights, so you'll see that in the tail end of the video, but keep in mind that I did have to get a little creative with this endeavor. As I make my way to the undercourse of the opposite side, I did find that the easiest way of finding this angle is just bringing over your shingle and marking exactly where you want that angle to be, and note that at the top and bottom of that shingle. Then all you have to do is cut it off and nail it off as needed. I'm also protruding the bottom of these cedar shingles approximately a ½ inch past our metal drip edge flashing, and that's just going to have a nice consistency around this entire perimeter, along with hiding that metal edge, which I don't want fully visible for everyone to see unless they're standing right up next to this unique monstrosity. Beautiful monstrosity. Each time I bust open a bundle of cedar shake, I generally try and sort them in between 3 different sizes, large, medium, and small, and that way I'm able to determine and have a nice layering process between the larger sizes, smaller sizes, and the medium sizes along the way. In theory, as long as we're overlapping all of our seams, as well as covering up all of our nails, we should be good to go to our next row, and so on and so forth. As I noted in my previous video, and I'll make sure to mention it again, is that each one of these bundles is for underlayment. The underlayment for cedar shake, which is generally not preferable on a whole house, but because this is just a tree house, I decided to go with it, especially with the overall cost structure. Each one of these bundles covered approximately 1.5 sides of this roof, and each bundle was approximately $30. If I wanted to go with the higher end #1 Western red cedar shingle version, those were close to $250 a bundle, which seems quite ridiculous, and the reason why I went with the underlayment cedar shake for this entire structure. And if I have any issues long term with this build with water intrusion, I'll make sure and let everyone know by tagging a comment in the comment section of this video. So keep that in mind if you're watching this video a year from now. And as always, I will also have links for all tools and materials in the video description. So I will make sure to have a link for these cedar shakes, as well as the more expensive version if you are so inclined. With our entire structure sited, I can move on to the transition between our skylight and our cedar shake. Now this is a bit of a unique circumstance because I didn't install the cedar shake first, I installed the skylight first. And to make sure that the water that hits the skylight doesn't go automatically right underneath our cedar shake, I apply a flashing tape membrane to cover up that seam and then reinstall my screws as needed. With this geodesic dome, there are 5 sides of the roof, which means there are 5 corners in between those sides that we have to do something about to have a nice seamless look in the end. In order to keep our cedar shake look consistent, I grabbed these rough lumber cedar boards, cut them in half, and then glue and nail them together. I'm using Titebond 3, which can be used in exterior uses, as well as stainless steel 18 gauge nails. With all these boards glued and nailed up, I let it dry overnight and have a distinct realization that I don't know the exact angle that I need for the ends of the cut so they can line up appropriately. So what I do is I just guesstimate it. I basically just max out my miter saw, which in this case is 60 degrees on one side. However, the other side didn't go all the way to 60 degrees. So in order to get that angle, I just mark a line on the opposite side and make sure our second cut cohesively mirrors the first cut on the opposite side. The opposite side of the board is cut down to size and receives a bevel cut at approximately 30 degrees. Once we have those 2 cuts accounted for, we are ready for installation. Prior to screwing down these boards, I grab a piece of pipe insulation, cut it in half, and use that as a good way of filling those high spots and low spots evenly while I'm screwing down each piece of cedar trim. Now I do realize that after the first one, it is much easier to install the trim if our installation is just on our skylight area and not on our cedar siding. So I did that in lieu of running our installation all the way down on all the other pieces of trim. Just a helpful note is that I would suggest pre-drilling your holes before you drill into that acrylic as well. Even if you're barely screwing into it, you might break it if you don't pre-drill your holes first. Once all 5 corners are trimmed out, I use the same cedar board material, place a 31.6 degree cut on both sides, and use that as a nice clean way to cover up all of our flashing tape at the top of our treehouse. I use the same 18 gauge stainless steel nails that I used previously, and I'm just going through the siding in this application, obviously not our acrylic because I don't want to damage that potentially. But with all of our nailing finally complete, we now have to come to the realization that a lot of our nails have penetrated all the way through. Yes, and I didn't want to go short on this, I could have, but I wanted to make sure that we had proper penetration, and these were the shortest nails that I could find at my local hardware store. So if you wanted something that was stainless steel that was shorter, you were going to have to order something that was not found on the shelf. Luckily for us, I have a diamond blade on my grinder, which made quick work of these nails. Even though they're stainless steel, there's still no match for the diamond wheel. Even though I can say that they were no match for the grinder, this still took plenty of time. We're talking about hundreds of nails, and it probably took me a good 15 minutes to do each panel, so it took me a couple hours to do this entire thing. But well worth it from my perspective because we have proper installation for our cedar shake, and we don't have any intrusive nails for my kids to run into later on. Speaking of running into, I don't want my kids to run into the sides of these cedar panels. Number 1, to hurt themselves, and 2, these cedar shakes that are on the edge are going to be more prone to damage. So in order to protect both sides, I install another layer of pressure treated lumber at these side locations just to make sure there's less shingles protruding past the entryway. If I have to cut these down eventually, I will, but I figure this will be a good first step, and if I need to cut them, I will.
Trying to build some steps here. In order to do so quickly and efficiently, we're just going to do some box steps. Very structurally sound and way less math, so a win-win. All we have to do is take the measurement from the ground to the bottom of our fascia and then divide that for our riser. On this project, we are going to be having 3 boxes at approximately 7.5 inches. Perfect.
Each one of our steps is going to be 11 inches deep, therefore the bottom step needs to be 33 inches deep, which is why I'm taking that measurement, subtracting 3 inches, which gives us 30 inches. That's because we're accounting for the front and back plates, which needs to be cut however wide you want. Now in this case, we are going with 31.5 inches because that's basically all I have for scrap, and that's as wide as we're going to get with this set of stairs. The center support is placed in the dead center of our box, and the entire box is nailed off with 3-inch long galvanized nails. Before I fully nail off our center support, I do double check our cross-dimensional measurement, making sure that we're square before we nail off that center support. If not, it just needs a little bit of a love tap in one direction or the other. For our second and third boxes, they're designed the same exact way, it's just different depths. So the second row of boxes is going to be 22 inches in depth, and the final box is going to be only 11 inches in depth. They're all exactly 31.5 inches wide, and that's exactly why this system is so easy to build, because it's such a simplistic structure, and all you have to do is stack one on top of the other on top of the other. One key caveat to this application is that you do want a smooth, level surface for this box to be laid upon, and you could lay it just in the ground, but I want this framing to last as long as possible, so I lay down bricks first, make sure that they're level, and then place our structure right on top of those. That means that we have 0 ground contact for our framing, and that means it will last as long as possible and less degrading over time. I drill each box into each other with some 2.5-inch galvanized screws, and that really stiffens up the entire structure, and I'm not worried about this tipping over at any point. If I find myself concerned in the future, I can always attach it directly to our deck eventually, but at this point in time, there's no need, and this thing is solid as can be. With a bit of scrap decking from a previous project, I'm able to finish off these steps very nicely with some Cortex screws. These screws can be drilled into the dead center of the board, but they also come with caps that perfectly conceal each screw head, so it's a very nice finish in the end. Each one of these boards is approximately 5.5 inches deep, which is why I leave about a ½ inch of spacing in between each one of these boards, which not only provides a nice ½ inch overhang on the front, but it also has a nice solid gap in between the boards so there's less debris that gets stuck. As I mentioned previously, these screws do come with their own design caps, and that perfectly matches our decking boards. Just make sure you're installing these with a smooth faced hammer so you're not indenting our deck boards with some type of waffle hammer. Of course, any good treehouse worth its weight has to have some type of slide, so I picked up this one on Amazon, which was a 2-part that bolted together, and it had rave reviews, so I'll make sure that this is also linked in my description box below. As far as installation goes, I centered up our slide, pre-drilled our holes, and then secured it nicely with some larger sizable screws. Now this system does come with screws, however, they're very chintzy and tiny, so I did want to beef it up a bit and use some more substantial screws. Note to self.
So after placing so much weight on this structure, I have realized that there's a bit of a sway. As you can see, a little bit of a shimmy. Not really worried about the structural support down below, but I want to try and stiffen that up a little bit, and that's where some bracing is going to be needed.
Luckily for us, bracing like this is extremely straightforward. All we have to do is take a 4x4 piece of pressure treated lumber and cut a 45-degree on both sides. Now, depending on your structure, this length can be different. The larger the better, but in this application, I'm trying to make sure that they're all consistent in the same size. So I go off of the smallest post that we have, and that means that each one of these pieces is 20 inches long. Once all of our bracing cut, I then pre-drill all of our screws into position. Makes it a lot easier when we're in very tight-knit, odd areas. And if we have these ready to go, the installation of our bracing is very fast. With bracing like this, I don't even measure anything at this point. As long as each piece of bracing is flush up against our post and our beam, I'm very confident that this is exactly where I want it because every single piece is the same exact size. Also keep in mind that this might be a bit of overkill from certain perspectives, but this is literally $40 worth of material and an hour of your time, so it's definitely well worth it to brace up this structure just to make sure that we have a nice stiff structure for years to come, especially with who knows how many kids are going to be playing on this eventually.
Bracing in. Oh, way better. Unbelievable how that stiffens up the entire structure. It's needed.
A substantial amount of effort went into this project, but I certainly think it was well worth it. From all the details, along with the fact that this was my very first time working with a dome structure and not just perfectly square walls, was a challenge, but a challenge it was worth taking on because not only did I learn a new skill set of building, but it also has such a beautiful, unique look. But what does everyone else think about this project?
Uh-oh, here comes Cody! Here comes Cody! Here comes baby Luca! Ah!
Wow!
Oh my goodness, party!
Wow!
It's so cool! Yeah, let's go down the hard way. Woo! Good job, sweetie.
The look on everyone's faces when looking up at that amazing structure was probably the best moment of this entire build by far so far, and this is exactly the reason why I put so much effort into it. I do plan on implementing a few more fun, chaotic items around this entire build, whether it's a rock climbing wall, a tree net, water cannon, zip line, and so forth. Who knows what we're going to be building, but all I know for sure is that this is truly one beautiful, sexy beast of a treehouse. Oh yeah,